Gonar the Pict. How many of you recognize that name? How many of you, when I say that, say, huh, I know who that is? Well, for those of you who do you really know who that is? Everybody, I'm coming to you from the library today because I've been having some thoughts and I've been doing a little bit of reading, and today we're going to be walking through yet another Hyborian age conspiracy theory, but this one's slightly Thurian as well. So, if you know your Robert E. Howard, you know your Kull the Conqueror, King Kull, Kull the Savage, and you know your Conan the Barbarian, well, have I got one for you. Let's get into it. So what brought us here? Well, I'll tell you, this was an interesting one because this was actually triggered by a prior video I did for this channel, actually. It's where I did a review of this. And this is Conan and the Ravagers Out of Time, which was a pretty cool Marvel graphic novel that came out around 1992. Interesting story, and I'll put a link up to it over here for those of you who want to know what actually happened in it. But Cole's notes, it's a time-spanning story that has Conan, Kull, and Red Sonja basically solving a problem. But what's happened within this is you have this, what is presented as a secondary character, doing some rather interesting things. And that character is, in fact, Gonar the Pict. So when I read that story, I went, I know that guy from somewhere. So I went back and did some digging. And I'll tell you, when I did some digging, all that happened was I just said to myself do I really know this guy? Because there seems to be some fairly major disconnects here. So what we're going to walk through today is I'm going to walk through the original Robert E. Howard content that basically describes the character. And I'll give you sort of a surface level of what you can get from that, but not really the conclusive point, because just like every other thing that Robert E. Howard wrote, he was a master of the onion. You're peeling layers away all the time, wondering what's inside there, and you can only really give it a best guess. So we'll get that point, we'll get that nut out of there. And then we're going to say, okay, well, now we know this. How does that compare to the Marvel adaptation, and who is this person over here? Because I can tell you right now, they're definitely not the same thing. At the end of the day, we're going to come back with my Tennessee Fats Hyborian age conspiracy theory of what I think Gonar the Pict actually is in the Hyborian age and how it fits in. It's going to be a little out there. It's going to be a little off, but I think at the end of the day, we're pretty much all going to enjoy some different interpretations. So let's start off with the Robert E. Howard content and say, really, what did he write about this guy? There you go. Let's talk our way through what actual Robert E. Howard material was with regards to Gonar the Pict, shall we? There are really two books in which Gonar makes an appearance that were written by Robert E. Howard. One's an earlier one where he's fairly fleshed out, and one's a later one where he's really just coming in as somebody wandering into a dream sequence. And let's just walk through the two of them here, shall we? The first one is Kings of the Night, which is a classic. It's a story of Bran Mak Morn, who lived, I guess, roughly 200 years AD in Robert E. Howard's world. And then King Kull. Now, what's interesting is this is an early tale on the development of King Kull. So at this point in time, Robert E. Howard really hadn't flushed out the whole timing of the age between the Thurian and the Hyborian age. So when he's writing about it here, Kull's time literally is 100,000 years prior to the time of Bran Mak Morn. Well, if Conan takes place 10,000 years prior to the time of Bran Mak Morn, that means there's a 90,000 year gap between the time of Kull and Conan. That's a big number. The story is fairly simplistic though. I mean, the idea here is that Bran Mak Morn is trying to fight back the Roman legionnaires, and he's trying to unite his people, and he's got a group of Vikings that don't want to fight with him, or at least they're bickering somewhat as to how they're going to fight with him. I'm not going to go into full detail. We're going to paraphrase here, because really the idea here, we're sticking to Gonar content, okay? So the idea is he's trying to unite them. Gonar comes wandering in as this elder statesman type druid character that seems to know what he's talking about, and makes clear references to the fact that he knows when it's time to actually give people the sort of Pict or druid that they're looking for to encourage them. He makes the reference to the fact that he knows enough to actually, do the saber rattling and the snakeskin reading and the entrail reading when necessary to get people encouraged, but he recognizes that sometimes these things are just necessary for that very purpose. Kind of an interesting comment coming from a man of magic that opens the whole story by literally executing a Roman legionnaire to rip out his heart and read the future in it. Clearly shows you this guy kind of gets it, and he's probably a little grizzled. Interesting characters development right there, and you go, okay, great. Bran is having a hard time getting his folks to fight together, and basically the Vikings are they're bickering about whether they're going to fight for Bran or go over to the Romans. And Gonar comes walking and says, You need a king to lead you guys? I'll get you a king. No problem. I got you covered. And he handles this whole thing like with real cockiness and a real understanding that he's going to make this thing work. And then suddenly out of the rising sun comes King Kull wandering out, completely chainmailed up, sword on him, ready to go, basically doing exactly what you expect King Kull to do. Comes in, effectively convinces Bran and Gonar that he's the guy, which was kind of interesting because Gonar kind of knew he was the guy. And then at the end of the day, convinces the Vikings to fight for him by executing who was then the Viking leader in basically trial by combat. Kind of an interesting thing for Kull to do, and it really does show some Kull development, but not quite the same as it shows Gonar development. Beginning of the story, you have Gonar basically being this future time where this 200 AD Pict or Druid that has been advising Bran since long before Bran even remembers him being an advisor to this Pictish people. Oftentimes referencing the fact that in his dreams, he goes back and speaks to the first Gonar, and they're very clear that they're talking about that language of the first Gonar, that they're communicating over time. But one of the things that is discussed in here is that Gonar is very clear that he's saying, I give people what they need to see in order for them to be successful. Who determines what success is? How does he know what people want to see? And how much of what he's doing actually is just giving people what they want to see? He's able to bring Kull from 100,000 years in the past to that point in time to help fight for Bran to, well, really unify the Pict nation at that point in time. So they'll continue to go on and fight the Romans back further in a further adventure. Kind of an interesting thing. But at the same time, he's very clear that I talked to the first Gonar, but I know things where if I told you, Bran, these things and explained them to you for a lifetime, you still wouldn't understand, and it would blow your pathetic little mind. Very clear that what he knows is well beyond what any human being on the planet knows, because it would just decimate their brains, which is kind of an interesting thing for him to be saying. If he literally was just, let's call it, a 200-year AD Druid working for the Picts, probably wouldn't be going that far into, I know all this stuff. Probably a little bit overdoing it there on trying to prove what he knows, because you could look at it this way. Maybe I'm just trying to prove my position to Bran, or maybe I actually do know all this stuff. Why would you know all this stuff if you've only been alive for, let's just call it a single lifetime around this point in time? Very strange, very interesting way of looking at things where he's talking to the first Gonar, but is not the first Gonar. Kull himself, when he comes to the future, after he looks at him at first thinking he's Gonar, then says, actually, no, you're not my Gonar. You are not the Gonar I know. Kull himself identifies, this is not the guy that I know. Not the guy that put me to sleep over here magically and told me I'd have a cool dream. This guy's different. Kind of interesting. That gives you sort of Cole's notes of what happens in the Kings of the Night. Now, let's talk about the Worms of the Earth story. Worms of the Earth story came out a couple years later and is incredibly short. In that, what you have is basically Gonar wandering in to see Bran during a dream, effectively. And in this one, you don't really get much Gonar content. Really what Gonar is doing is he's scolding Bran to a point. He's saying, listen, I know what you're thinking about using against the Romans here, but there are certain things you shouldn't do. And by the way, getting in contact with those guys, that's something you can't do because that portal is closed. And Bran turns around and says, there are middle grounds here where I'm going to be able to get him. And Gonar comes back and is like, whoa, this is bad. And actually is scolding Bran at that point in time because there are certain things, even in this world, you should not use against the Romans. Again, not much dialogue coming out of that one because it was incredibly short. But what do you get from this? You get that he's able to talk to him in a dream. That's cool. You get that he knows about these other things that Bran is trying to get his hands on. I'm not going to ruin the story for you. And that they're really, really bad. He knows that access to them to this world is completely closed off. And once again, he presents as somebody who knows all this stuff, which otherwise he wouldn't necessarily know, especially if these things haven't had access to the earth for millennia and are inaccessible. Why would he know that? It's kind of odd. So what was Robert E. Howard really doing here? What was he writing in the character? Well, here's my theory, okay? Here's what I think Robert E. Howard is writing, because Robert E. Howard was creating a character that was fairly unique. I went back and I actually looked to see if there was any sort of Lovecraftian sort of model that he could have been building off of this one. I couldn't find anything when I was doing my searching. If you guys know something that actually matches in Lovecraft, that could have possibly triggered this, let me know. Tippity in the comments below. I believe what Robert E. Howard was writing here was a character that actually is able to move through time. I believe what he was hinting at is that you have a character that either through, we'll call it reincarnation, or at least a very strong familial line of direct breeding going straight down to continue to make new Gonars all the way through, he was creating that. Now, which one of those two was it? I don't think we're ever going to know. And the issue here is that you have the hinting that Robert E. Howard put in the language of Gonar in his own story, where he's saying, no, I know more than you know. If I told you what I know, I'd blow your little mind. Like, those comments are enough to make you go, there's something much more to this guy at 200 years AD than we're getting the actual knowledge of. And really, if you're a guy, again, this is me just theorizing, who can live for 100,000 years, up to 200 years AD, are you actually going to look the same that entire time? Seems somewhat strange to me. It does seem odd that it was very clear that these two are different looking things, yet this one seems to know so much. Odd. Really, all we can get from it is we know that it's something that does exist through time. There is a Gonar that goes on through time. Is it reincarnation? Who knows? Is it the same dude? I don't know. Is it a really strong familial line where literally father to son to son to son to son? What happened if there was a daughter in there? To son to son to son to son? You don't know. But that's clearly what Robert E. Howard was getting to. So let's take a look at the actual Marvel content now and where we see that and what they did with the character. Okay, so we've got through the Robert E. Howard content of what he particularly wrote about Gonar. So now let's talk about the Marvel stuff. Now this is where things go a little strange. And of course, you know what's happening here. It's being done in the mighty Marvel way, which is exactly why you end up with this character developing into something else altogether. First place I found Gonar content was in here. This is my Conan the Barbarians, or a Cull, the Complete Savage Sword of Conan omnibus. And in this you have the Cull and Bran Mak Morn story of Kings of the Night. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one because honestly, this is probably one of the best Robert E. Howard adaptations in comic format ever. Ever. This matches exactly what Robert E. Howard wrote throughout, all the way through. There is one deviation, and it is minor. And I think this is more so the case of Marvel trying to, let's just call it, cover their bases. In the original Robert E. Howard story, King Cull's time is clearly 100,000 years prior to the time of Bran Mak Morn. What you find in the actual Savage Sword of Conan adaptation is that has changed now. It is now untold eons, countless ages. It's vague references instead of an exact number of 100,000 years. Okay, all right, well, either way, all the rest of the content's the same. Everything that I just gave you guys about what Robert E. Howard said about this guy in that original story, still there. He's depicted as basically what you would picture a prototypical druid to look like. His long gray hair, long beard, long flowing robes, and he's out there carving out hearts. I don't know if that's exactly where a druid would be going, but you know, it is what it is. The next time you see Gonar pop up in a Marvel comic is a little bit later, and it's in the Conan the Barbarian series. And I actually have a collection of that here, of all 3 issues that lead to that story in Conan Saga number 86. And what it is, it's a reprint of Conan numbers 66, 67, and 68, which is a culmination of what was then a Red Sonja series that led to a crossover. And in that, Conan and Cull end up fighting. And they fight in the Hyborian age, because Cull's been brought forward. I'm not going to go into a lot of details to what exactly happened here and why that happened. But I'll tell you this. I'm not going to count this as Gonar real material, because it turns out the Gonar that you see in those issues, well, actually just one issue, is not Gonar. It is a nameless priest who works with Othamon that happens to have a page from the Book of Skelos, and that's really what's happened there. So really anything that could happen in that story that has to do with Gonar is not Gonar. So if you're picking that up saying to yourself, I'm going to get myself a really good idea of this Gonar guy for the 4 panels that he had, it ain't him. So just move on. You're not going to get it. The next reference we have is much later. You go all the way back to 1992 now. You're jumping forward almost 20 years here at this point in time. And that takes you to the Marvel graphic novel that I referenced earlier, which is The Ravagers Out of Time. In that, you have Gonar basically finding his way into the hands of Conan and Red Sonja. And when Conan sees Gonar, he says, wait, isn't this that guy from that dream we had? And Red Sonja's like, you're an idiot. It wasn't a dream. You know it wasn't a dream. You literally fought King Kull. And also at the same time, that wasn't actually this guy, because that was somebody else. Do you remember shooting an arrow through that guy and then he died? Clearly not Gonar. Anyways, the depiction though carries forward. The depiction that came out of that original Conan the Barbarian number 68 of basically very skinny, white individual, shaved head, long beard, arms, chest, whole body covered in blue tattoos. That's how they continue to depict Gonar the Pict now. What was set in the 70s with that original Conan the Barbarian now is following into the Conan the Ravagers Out of Time. So forget the old druid guy that you saw in Bran Mak Morn's time, even though there's really no way to see if he's covered in tattoos because he's covered in robes. You now have this other depiction carrying forward, which is kind of odd. I don't really get the stylistic change, but I think we'll get to there in a second, okay? In this particular story, though, the Gonar that's found his way into the hands of Conan and Red Sonja is with them while they're going on an adventure where they run into a giant gold-eating slug. And if you want all the story on that one, just go watch the prior video I did on that graphic novel, and it walks through exactly what happened there. They get transported back to the time of King Kull, and they end up fighting King Kull. There's a whole issue there, and Gonar that actually exists in the time of King Kull looks the exact same as the Gonar that's sitting in the hands of Conan and Red Sonja in their time. Bear in mind, we're now dealing with Marvel timeline of 18,000 years in the past King Kull time to 10,000 years in the past King Conan time. Okay, so 8,000 year delta between those two. So they're looking the exact same. We're not quite getting what we saw previously in Kings of the North, where they were slightly different, and Kull said, no, that's not my Gonar. You're talking about the exact same dude, okay? Now, Gonar that's sitting in King Kull's time starts casting a massive spell, and he does everything he needs to do. And at the end of the day, that really solves the problem that Kull, Sonja, and Conan are dealing with, which is fine. It's a great thing that happens. Everybody's happy. And Conan and Sonja end up going back to the future. Within this, there's a little bit of dialogue, though. The dialogue that happens between Conan and Gonar in Kull's time, where he says, oh yes, that's right. You're going to go forward in time and meet my twin, air quotes. And the Gonar that he matches in the future, when they end up going back to the future, says, oh, do I really look that different? Are you sure? There's clearly an inference here that, something's going on here. Because, you know, when all that magic was flying around, lightning bolts that brought everybody back into Kull's time, and everybody died except for Sonja and Conan that went back in time, Gonar the Pict was just standing there and basically watching the whole thing happen, going, yep, and when's this going to be over? And how long is it going to take for you two idiots to come popping back? Oh yeah, and that'll happen in T-minus now. Clearly seemed to know what was going on, clearly seemed to have a sense of what was going on, and clearly seemed to know there was no need to do anything other than watch the whole thing doing this. That was basically it. Kind of an interesting take on this. Conan and Sonja make their way back though, okay? Bear that in mind, bear that, log it, move on. They make their way back to their Hyborian age and they go off on a new adventure. And within that, you get two issues within this where Gonar is actually present. The first one being they make their way back, they go off. It's Savage Sword Conan number 223. The next one goes to 224. In 224, they run into another Thurian problem, which is actually the Mirrors of Thuz and Thun, where Gonar and Thuz and Thun actually end up in a conflict. Thuz and Thun looks at Gonar, looks at Conan and Red Sonja, and says, you know, of all the people that are in here right now, the only real challenge I have is from you, Pict, so you're the one I'm dealing with first. Shows Gonar an image of himself advising King Kull at the time of King Kull. And for some reason, somehow, that makes Gonar undone. As in, gone. Not flown into the mirror, not, you know, they did say he was sucked in the mirror, but not really to the point where he's trapped in the mirror, just gone. Clearly a sense that, okay, has he just been sent back to the time of King Kull? And then, of course, Thuz and Thun ends up going on and replacing Gonar, replacing Conan and Sonja with evil doppelgangers of themselves, doppelgangsters, if you want to think of it that way. And then they go off on an adventure that lasts for another 10 issues, which I'm not going to get into here because it doesn't actually involve Gonar. The only thing that you need to know within those subsequent issues, though, is that Gonar does end up reaching out in time, pulling Conan and Sonja out of basically the dinosaur era, brings them into Kull's era to help solve a problem in Kull's time. but you already saw Gonar seeing himself in Kull's time and disappearing into what you assumed was the past, but there's only one Gonar there. There isn't two, there's one. Huh, so he went back in time because he went back in time, or did he just completely cease to exist in the future because he saw himself in the past? Kind of an interesting one. It kind of made you sort of go, huh, because the Gonar that actually brought them back at the dinosaur era into Kull's time said, you're going to deal with an issue that we need to deal with right now, right here. Sonya, you're going to go off and deal with this other issue over here to bring Kull back off of the time ledge that he's at to bring him to here. And by the way, I'm also going to help you guys fight this black sorcerer to hold the throne until Kull can arrive back here. And a very important point is made right then and there by Brule, the Spear Slayer, that Gonar the Pict's magic is based in time. That's right, time. Yeah, so time. I just did it 3 times because I really wanted to sink in here. So really you've got Gonar the Pict with all this magical crazy sorcery thing that's happening, and his whole magic is based in time. It's not actually based on any other form of magic. When he dispelled this black demon monster thing that was fighting against Conan and Brule, it was with time magic. It wasn't with anything else. He didn't dissipate him. He threw time at him. When Gonar was in Ravagers out of time, and he said, I can cast this spell to get rid of giant gold-eating slug, giant monster thing. All I need is time. And then when they say, oh, how'd you do that? Oh, so when you know these two, when they came back in time, they brought me 8,000 years of time to fuel the spell. It really gives you a sense of, oh, this is what Marvel's going with. So forget the next 10 issues of that particular story, which are a really good Thuzen Thune story, by the way, in case any of you really want to read it. And an awesome Fafnir story as well, if you really want to get into that. It's the later issues of Savage Swords, so you're going to spend a pretty penny to get your penny on those pages. But, it is entirely worth it. But really, you get a sense here that Marvel has now created a Gonar that really is a master of time. So not so much a sorcerer, not somebody that would be looking into the chest of somebody and pulling out a heart and telling the future unless he already knows the future. Talking about somebody who clearly is continuing the actual line that he pulled in the actual Kings of the Night, which is, well, actually the past, the present, and the future all exist at once. Time doesn't exist. Clearly drilling down on that, and you've now created something that's based in time. Now, what is that in time, though? That's the issue, because guess what? Marvel's never thrown Gonar anywhere else. Why is it he ceases to exist after the Hyborian age? I'm really not getting a sense of that. I'm not getting a whole understanding of why that's the case, but clearly Marvel has created some sort of a time thing that just continues to exist throughout time. I honestly don't believe that Gonar was sent back into the past when he looked in that mirror of Thuzen Thune. I think he ceased to exist and simply flew back to the consciousness of what he was at that time, because time doesn't exist. Very, very odd. Weird way for Marvel to go with this character. Built a little bit on the Robert E. Howard, but clearly going in a direction that's much more powerful than what we just saw in the original Robert E. Howard story. Okay, we got the Hat of Lunacy on, so you know it's time for me to throw my crazy theory at this. Now, we've already talked about what Robert E. Howard said about this. Really, we have a sense that somehow Gonar is moving through time. We don't know how he's moving through time. We don't know what manifestation of that it is. And really, you need to go back to the fact that this is 90 years old, okay? I will give Robert E. Howard phenomenal amounts of credit on this, because in Kings of the Night, you clearly have not one, but 2 references to the fact that time doesn't exist. The past, the present, and the future are one. Now, if you think about this is some fairly complex stuff. Like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around why quantum physics is telling me that today. I'm still sitting here going, what? I think I get the overall idea, and I think I get the idea that time as we perceive it is just our perception of time, and that time itself is infinite but all at once, and really free will might, it gets really, really complex. But you gotta give Robert E. Howard credit here. He was building a world and a whole universe in this writing where he was acknowledging something so out there that we're still struggling with it today. That I think is phenomenal. So you got to understand that we're going 90 years ago where he was trying to figure out how this thing, this Gonar concept, existed both in time and out of time. Kind of a neat thing. Now, Marvel has gone beyond that. Marvel has really said that this Gonar is clearly the same guy, living forever, just infinite, ad infinitum. He's always going forward. Okay, I get that. And you know, I really do think that's proven when they have that Thun mirror thing where I believe he just ceases to exist when he sees himself because maybe two of him can't exist at the same time. I don't know. Again, we're going with some pretty out there quantum physics at this point in time. What do I think Gonar is? Well, honestly, when I'm looking at this, and if I was really drilling down on what Robert E. Howard was doing here, I have to say that I think Gonar is an agent of time. I think Gonar exists in time and has the ability to move through time, but I believe he's trapped in time with the linearity that you and I have the exact same problem with. But he has the ability to understand that the past, present, and future all exist at the same time, so he can see all of it. When he's making references to the fact that I know things that would melt your brain if I told you, and you will never understand what I'm trying to communicate to you, it clearly tells me that he's a step beyond what Cull is actually dealing with here and the material world that we live in. He's above and beyond that. He's something else altogether. But what is he? He's an agent of time, which is really where things get kind of interesting. Because you got a guy here that knows all time. He knows everything that exists. He's enacting within this world. He's influencing the world, past, present, and future at the same time while he's doing all of this. So could you then not step back and say, could it be, Tennessee Fats, that Gonar the Pict is in fact a time cop? No, hear me out here. Hear me out, okay? Who's choosing what's right and wrong? Who's choosing what he's supposed to? How did he know he was supposed to help Rand McMore and push the Romans back? Why did he do that? How did he know that he had to get called back into the present, or the past more correctly, but at the same time have him in the future where he's helping? What's making him choose what he's doing? There's got to be something driving him. Something in here that's larger than Gonar, but that's driving Gonar. You're not talking about a Gandalf that's a free agent bouncing through time, helping Middle-earth. You're talking about somebody that exists at all time, that for some reason is choosing what's right and what's wrong. So that's why I put it to you. Gonar the Pict is, in fact, fantasy's first time cop. Well, there it is, everybody. I gotta tell you, when I first went down this rabbit hole of what the hell is a Gonar, I never expected in a million years that I would be coming up with an idea as outlandish as blending quantum physics and literally some really weird sci-fi ideas into a classic sword and sorcery genre. Honestly, the whole idea was just so out there. There's no way I could have seen it coming. That being said, if all time does exist, past, present, future at the same time, I really should have seen that coming. So that's honestly on me. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this one. This was an interesting one. I really enjoyed going back in a character which was incredibly minor and finding all the little nuances that I could to that character in written format. It took me a fair amount of time to read everything that was necessary on this one because honestly, it's spread all over the place. It's like sand in the wind, just trying to get particular grains out to get what you need. But at the end of the day, it was a kind of cool quest, and I enjoyed going through it. If you enjoy these Robert E. Howard conspiracy theories, by all means, click on the like button, subscribe to the channel, post a comment below. If you think I'm absolutely nuts on this one, feel free to type a comment below because honestly, I do enjoy hearing from you guys. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you in the next video.